Welcome to our morning seminar talking about various finance issues for general practice. Lentells have a specialist healthcare department. We currently have 4 directors who deal with GP practices, as well as a dedicated and expert team of staff, some of whom are here today, who deal with all aspects of finance for general practice. We currently act for over 170 practices throughout the Southwest and beyond, and we deliver all our services from our offices in Chard. We are being videoed this morning, so if you need to recap anything that we've said, does this work? Is that better? Yes. Thank you. So we are being videoed this morning. If you need a recap about what we're talking about, then the video clips will be available through our website. We're planning on running through till 10:45, and then we'll have a coffee break, and then lunch is at 12:30. Timings may vary depending on how talks progress and how many questions there are. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, or further explanation of any of the points if required. So, I'm going to talk about the new contract changes from April this year. I thought this was going to be a relatively quick talk, because actually the surprising thing about the contract changes from April is that very little has changed at all. So, in terms of the contract, there is a 1% increase included in the contract changes for profits for GPs. There is a 3% increase to cover overhead expenses, but that's basically it. Now the 1% at the moment is provisional. It may change depending on the results of the DDRB review, which isn't likely to be published until May, and at that time, if it does recommend an increase of more than 1%, that will be backdated to 1st of April. We'll have to wait and see on that. Now, in terms of global sum funding, that's increased from £85.35p per weighted patient up to £87.92 per weighted patient. There is absolutely no change to the way the weighting is calculated. Now, there was talk that there would be significant changes either this year or next year in terms of how the weighting is calculated. The main factor being deprivation. So there was a lot of talk about increasing the weighting for deprivation. That has not happened. Your weighted list size will be calculated in exactly the same way as it always has been. Now, £85.35 up to £87.92 is more than you would expect. That isn't all new money. Some of that is being recycled. It's being recycled from the GMS MP correction factor, which is being removed. That's being reinvested in GMS baselines, and also seniority continues to reduce. That's going into the GMS funding. In terms of the out-of-hours adjustment, that is a direct calculation based on the amount you're receiving in the global sum. This also applies to PMS practices. So the out-of-hours adjustment is now 4.87% compared to 4.92%. The idea is that the actual charge you pay for the out-of-hours opt-out will not change. So the percentage has reduced. Now, most PMS practices are on a GMS equivalent contract, so you get paid exactly the same money for your court funding, and then it's topped up with PMS premium monies. So this out-of-hours adjustment will do exactly the same. Indemnity funding. Who has received your increased chunk of money in March as a contribution towards the increase in indemnity costs? Yes, you should all have received that in March. So last year it's 51.6p, but it's based on the registered list, not on the weighted list. This year it's £1, just over £1 per patient. Who has paid some of that over to their salaried GPs already? A few. Okay. This is absolutely not an issue where you have salaried GPs and you pay their MDU or MPS. You can completely ignore that. So if you pay it, absolutely fine, no action required. The idea is, though, that this money isn't just for the partners. This money is for all GPs who provide services for the patients in your practice. So the BMA has helpfully produced guidance on how you should distribute this money to salaried GPs. The BMA information is guidance only. It is absolutely not a requirement. It's only guidance. There is, however, a requirement in the core contract that practices come up with a suitable scheme for distributing that money to salaried GPs. And it's for you to determine what a suitable scheme is. So, in terms of practices who've already paid some of that out, how have you done it? Who's done it based on the number of sessions worked? That would be the normal thing to do. So, what you need to do is look at the number of sessions provided across the year, take your indemnity funding, divide by the number of sessions, multiply it by how many your salaried GPs do, and that could be the indication of how much you should pay out to them. But practices where they have significant locum costs, so they're using locums instead of salaried GPs, actually you need to do the calculation slightly differently, otherwise any salaried GPs you have will get a huge amount paid out for indemnity funding. On average, it works out at £228 per session per annum for the average practice, where a whole-time equivalent is 8 sessions. So that would be the sort of calculation we'd be looking at. So £228 per session. Now it says it's paid based on the raw patient list size. It was paid in March and it's based on the 1st of February's list size. No idea why it's the 1st of February. Really odd date to pick. None of the other funding is ever linked to 1st of February. But for this indemnity funding, absolutely 1st of February. Now, how many of you have received letters from your salaried GPs formally requesting a share of this funding? None so far. The BMA helpfully have issued a standard letter for all salaried GPs to use to write to their practice requesting formally their share of this money. So yes, you could expect at some stage salaried GPs to ask. Now the interesting thing is that most of the funding paid to practices now is based on the weighted list size. This, however, is based on your actual registered list. That gives a clear indication to me of what's going to happen when the new government indemnity scheme comes in. So, it's likely to come in from April next year, but it won't be free. Some practices are under the impression, actually, as partners we won't have to pay our MGU, we won't have to pay our MPS, we're saving 10 grand a year, fantastic, huge pay rise. That's not going to happen. The government is not going to provide this indemnity scheme for free. Because they are currently paying an amount based on your actual registered list, it's likely that the charge for the new government indemnity scheme will be based on your registered list. So from April next year, we are expecting an amount per patient to be charged to practices to provide for the government indemnity scheme. How that's going to be priced, no idea. What it's going to cover, absolutely no idea. But yes, it's likely to be based on the actual list. It will be a practice-based contract. It's likely to cover all clinicians who provide GMS and PMS services to your registered list. That leads on to a slight issue with locums. Will locums be covered by your practice paying for this government indemnity scheme? And yes, if locums are providing GMS services for your registered list, yes, it will probably mean that locums will be included. That leads on to another issue. Will locums then be reducing the rates they charge substantially because they will not be paying their indemnity funding? So they won't be paying their £10,000 a year for the MGE or MPS. They will be covered by the practices they work for. Therefore, their rates ought to reduce. A locum GP typically costs around £31 per session worked in terms of indemnity costs. So if you're paying at the moment £250 for a locum session, you might expect that from April next year it'll be £220. I don't think that's going to happen. Locums are not going to reduce their rates, which actually means a further cost pressure for practices, because not only are you paying for the government indemnity scheme funding, you've got to pay the same rates to locums, which means actually more cost for practices. So that could be a real issue from next April. But at the moment it's still being discussed, it's still being talked about. We don't know what's going to be covered by the government indemnity scheme. But you need to watch out for locum costs when it does come in. Referral funding. You will get 17p per weighted patient. It's a 1 year funding for this year only. It's likely to be a completely separate payment outside of the global sum. No indication yet as to when that money will be paid to practices. But yeah, 17p per patient. Seniority. Seniority is being phased out. 2018-2019, so the current year, this is the 5th year of a 6-year phasing out of seniority. It will all stop after March 2020. There will be no seniority payments. That money will be reinvested in the global sum and the PMS baselines. MPIG correction factors. So for GMS practices where you have an MPIG, that's continuing to reduce. This is the 5th year of a 7-year phasing out. So again, that will stop completely from March 2020. There will be no more MPIG correction factor funding. Again, that money is being reinvested in the global sum and the PMS baselines. PMS premiums. There are currently at least 2 levels of PMS premium being paid. So you get your NHS England PMS premium and you get your CCG PMS premium. They are completely separate funding streams. They are both reducing over a 4 or 5 year period, depending where you are and when the PMS reviews were carried out. Most are over a 5-year period, and that started from 1st of April 2016. So the PMS premiums will stop after 31st of March 2021. So the year after the seniority in the MPIG funding stops.
Sorry, one question. Can you remind me what MPIG stands for?
MPIG is the minimum practice income guarantee. So for GMS practices, where their historic funding before the 2004 contract came in was higher than it would be under the new contract, they were given a guarantee that they wouldn't be worse off, and they were paid this fixed lump of money. That fixed lump of money is the MPIG, and that's what's been reducing over the last few years. Quaff. No change in the number of points available, still 559 points. There was talk that there was going to be a massive reduction in terms of the number of quaff points, down to about 300. That hasn't happened. Quaff points remaining exactly the same. Now, what they are advertising is an increase in the value of quaff points. So they go from £171.20 up to £179.26. Yay! An increase in money. Absolutely not. For individual practices where their list size has stayed the same, there will be absolutely no change at all in the value of the quaff point. Because the value of the quaff point for your practice is based on your list size compared to the national average list size. The national average list size has increased, therefore the value of the point for your practice will stay exactly the same. This is the 6th year they have advertised an increase in the value of a quaff point, and it's the 6th year where there has been absolutely no change in the value of quaff points for individual practices. There is apparently, however, an extra £22 million being invested into quaff to fund this change. Not quite sure how those figures can possibly work, because actually the value for your practices won't change. Part of it will be extra funding because of the increase in population in England, but that's nowhere near going to go £22 million, so I'm not quite sure where they get their figures from. Vaccinations and immunisations. Historically they were £9.80. They have now gone up to £10 and 6p. For some, only some vaccinations have gone to £10 and 6p. Minimal amounts. Flu remains at £9.80, and flu is the big one. So they've kept that at £9.80 and they put a minimal increase on other vaccinations. In terms of premises funding, we have been waiting for the new premises directions for at least 2 years. They have still not been published. They will be published apparently shortly, but we do have a clear indication now of what will be included in those new premises directions. Historically, if you've applied for any grant funding, that's been restricted to 66% of the cost of the works being carried out. The new premises directions now allow for 100% funding for approved alterations and extensions. So who at the moment is in the throes of planning in terms of extensions or alterations to buildings and is applying for grants? Yeah. New rules, when they come out, when they're published, mean that yes, you could apply for 100% funding. The issue is that none of these premises directions changes are retrospective. So if you have already been granted the funding, if you've already started the work, if it's already an approved application, then no, you'll have to stick with the old percentages. But for some who are in that process, it may be worth having a talk to NHS England about whether things can be delayed to access the 100% funding rather than the 66% funding. Historically, any grant has never covered the purchase of land. So if you wanted to extend your building and you had to buy some land, that would never feature as part of the reimbursement in terms of grant money. That will change. So any grant funding under the new premises directions will include the purchase of land for extensions only, not for new builds. But it's not quite clear yet whether the purchase of land will be covered for grants where you are extending the car park, for example. Because that's not an extension to the building, but it is providing additional facilities for your patients. That's not clear yet. It's also not clear whether it will cover the situation where you buy an additional piece of land and construct a separate building which is not linked to your current building, but is in the same overall site. It's not clear whether that will qualify for the 100% funding or not. We'll have to wait for the detailed directions. And we've waited 2 years. We're hopeful they'll be published in the next couple of months, but we don't know. The other thing with grants is that if you are awarded a grant for improving premises, for extending premises, your notional rent is abated. So you don't get the full notional rent on the basis that actually you haven't paid for all that work. A lot of it has been funded by the NHS. So you won't get the full notional rent. They are now changing the way the abatement works. So historically, if you received up to £100,000, the abatement lasted for 5 years. If it was between 100 and 250,000, the abatement lasted for 10 years. And if it was over 250,000, the abatement was 15 years. They are now extending the years. So if it's up to 120,000, the abatement lasts for 6 years. 120 to 300,000, 9 years. 300,000 to 550,000, 12 years. 550,000 up to 1 million, 25 years. And then there's the possibility of an 18-year period as well. So abatement rules have changed and have been extended. So if you get large grants, you won't get the full notional rent for some time. They've also included clauses about the last man standing. Has anyone looked at the rules surrounding last man standing and the new premises directions? Because I think they're quite misleading. The last man standing clauses only relate to properties where you have historically received a grant for extensions or refurbishments and you are still in that rent abatement period. That's the only time these last man standing clauses apply. If you give up your contract, the contract is taken over by a new provider and they use the same premises, then the amount of the grant that remains outstanding does not have to be repaid. That means that the new occupier of the building will have reduced rent and it will be built into their lease. If premises are sold on the open market and they are not going to be used for NHS purposes, then the proportion of the grant remaining has to be repaid immediately to NHS England. If you are in leased premises and they haven't clarified what leased premises mean, does it mean a third-party landlord, or does it mean a combination of current partners and ex-partners who own the building and lease it to the practice? But for leased premises, if the building's no longer going to be used for NHS purposes, the grant is waived and is written off and does not have to be repaid. So there's some quite significant changes there, but it can be quite misleading. It only applies in the situation where you've historically received a grant for building works and you are still in the rent abatement period. Other things, rent reviews. They've changed the way that rent reviews are negotiated between landlords and tenants. This is only where you are in a leased building. Historically, you have had to agree formally the rent reviews with your landlord. That's then got to go to the district valuer, who then approves or not the level of rent. The rules are changing so that you need to demonstrate some negotiation, but not necessarily detailed negotiation, and then it's all sent off to the district valuer, and the district valuer will determine what the rent ought to be. If you are in an old building and you have received a grant historically, if you are then approved for a new build, so you move sites, that grant that was outstanding does not have to be repaid. That can be written off. That's quite a big change. So lots of practices who've received large grants over the last 10 to 15 years have decided not to move premises where they could because of the potential of repaying the grant. If NHS England now approves a new build, any grant relating to the old building will be written off and will not have to be repaid by the partners. But as I say, none of that is retrospective. These rules will only apply when the new premises directions are finally published and agreed. So, other contract changes. They're increasing the funding for parental leave for maternity and paternity. One big change is that they have now clarified that you can employ a salaried GP to cover for an individual who's on maternity or paternity leave, and that will be reimbursed as part of these rules. Historically, it was only if you employed locums, and there was an indication that perhaps it would cover salaried GPs. Now it's absolutely clear in the guidance that yes, if you employ a salaried GP for a fixed period to cover maternity pay, you can apply for the reimbursements. Just one thing with this, these are the maximum figures of reimbursement. The actual reimbursement will be the lower of the actual cost, all these amounts. They are not scaled down for part-time partners or part-time individuals. This is a fixed allowance. Interestingly, NHS England don't quite understand the rules regarding statutory maternity pay and the reimbursements which you effectively receive back from HM Revenue and Customs in terms of statutory maternity pay and those sorts of things. And it's quite often, in fact nearly always, practices will be overfunded where an individual goes off on maternity leave. That applies to partners and salaried GPs. So in practically all instances, practices make a profit where a part-time partner or part-time salaried individual goes off on maternity leave, because NHS England do not understand the rules. That's not to say that you employ a load of doctors who are of childbearing age just to make a profit.
Please do.
Sick leave. So again, they've increased the rates payable for sick leave, and again for sick leave you can employ a salaried GP to cover for sick leave. The other thing that practices need to think about is if they can't get locum cover, this locum reimbursement applies to internal locums. So it applies to partners doing extra work. Not necessarily extra sessions, but extra work. So if you're short by someone because they're off on sick leave, you can't get a locum to cover, your partners are working longer sessions as a result in order to do the work, those extra hours in terms of longer sessions can form part of the claim from NHS England for the sick leave reimbursement. Practices have got to be very careful about how they word the invoices, when they submit the invoices, but absolutely you need to put forward a claim for that. The other thing is other practices have said, oh, well, we don't need to worry about sick leave reimbursement. We've got plenty of GPs. They will just provide extra cover, and they will take off time off in lieu when we're back at full strength. No, absolutely not. You don't get any funding for time off in lieu. What you need to be doing is submitting invoices to NHS England for the extra work that the partners are doing. If the partners later on decide not to take that as time off in lieu, well, that's fine. Or if they do, that's fine. But for the purposes of claiming for the reimbursements, you need to charge for every extra hour and every extra session that your remaining GPs are doing in order to get the reimbursements. So, locum reimbursement only covers for GPs. So the sick leave will not cover for advanced nurse practitioners, any other clinicians. It also means that if you employ an advanced nurse practitioner to cover for maternity leave for a GP or sick leave, you get no reimbursement. These rules only apply for GP workload. So, other changes in the contract, there are some non-financial changes. So, violent patient regulations have altered slightly. It means that if there is a violent patient flag on the records, that is reasonable grounds for refusing registration and for deregistering a patient. So practices with less than 10% of their patients registered for online services will need to start working with NHS England to formulate a plan for increasing the uptake of online services. There's always been issues where practices try and provide and charge patients for services which are non-NHS services. There is now an absolute ban on advertising for private GP services where that work is available on the NHS. This is particularly relevant for things like certain minor surgery. You can't start advertising, oh, by the way, we've got a separate limited company and we can do this work for you. You've got to be very careful, and that's now formulated and part of the contract. There are some other weird changes in terms of the contract, which are non-financial. So they are going to pilot and evaluate NHS 111 doing direct bookings of GP appointments. So accessing your clinical software and booking in patients to see your GPs. There will be a formal trial starting to evaluate the process and how successful it is. Well, it'll be a complete disaster for practices. Patients might think it's great, but for practices it will be dreadful. But that will be trialled. They're also going to undertake a much bigger survey of locum use and costs in terms of locum use. Haven't said why and what the end result of this review of locum work will be. But yes, they're going to do a big survey on locum work and costs of locums. They are also going to do a stock take of practice premises. So to do a review of exactly what premises are provided for primary care purposes and the quality of those premises. I'm assuming that will lead on to extra funding for increased national rent, new grant schemes, all sorts of things, but maybe that's me being optimistic. But yes, they're going to start a full review of primary care premises. So that's all the contract changes. So actually, 35 minutes on contract changes. There's not much in the contract changes from 1st of April. Things that practices need to get to grips with are, yes, your global sum funding will be increasing, seniority and MPIG will be reducing, your PMS premium will be reducing. Actually, you only get a 1% increase in terms of your profits, which kind of implies that the pay rises for staff ought to be limited to 1%, despite the fact that it's been widely announced that public sector pay freeze and pay caps will be removed, but we've only been given a 1% increase in funding. That's something practices will have to wrestle with, but the indications are that yes, for practice staff there will be a 1% pay rise, and that's it.